Good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight we have Eva Chipiuk joining us. Eva is a lawyer who is part of the Freedom Corporation and the protesters in Ottawa. The team consisted of Keith Wilson and Brendan Miller, otherwise known as Miller Time. Last week, she had the opportunity to cross-examine Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and she used that opportunity to say some things that Canadians have been trying to get off their chest for quite some time now, for over 2 years. And as you all know, we were continuously silenced. So if we can welcome Eva. How you doing tonight?
Wonderful. Yourself?
I'm great. Thank you for being here with us. It's an honor to have you on here, and thank you. I was just going to ask you, actually, is there anyone else who's a part of the legal team that I didn't mention other than yourself and Mr. Miller and Keith?
Bathsheba Venderberg. I think I got her. I always get her name wrong, but she was there as well with us the whole time. She did some of the early cross examinations.
That's why I'm glad I asked you, because as soon as you just refreshed my memory, she did a fantastic job too as well. Can you give us a little bit of insight as to how exactly the Freedom Corporation came together?
That's a question I wasn't expecting, but everything came together from my understanding so quickly. And whenever I was interviewed or somebody asked about Tamara Leach being an organizer, I always had to stop them and say, nothing was organized because everything was so grassroots and just happening as it was going. So most of this stuff would take years to get organized and coordinated, but we were talking within days. On the spot decisions were being made. So my understanding is Tamara started that GoFundMe, and I think that was like January 13th. And it started to gain millions of dollars by the end of the month. And we're talking 2 weeks later, she recognized she needed a not-for-profit organization so that the money could go there. And that's how the Freedom Corp came to be. And it was people she didn't know at all. It was truckers that were in Ottawa or other people that were there and really taking a kind of a leadership role, only because they were able to do things that were helpful to the cause in Ottawa. So those were the people that ended up getting named in the Freedom Corp. And that's how it came to be, basically from conception to creation. It was about 2-3 weeks, is my understanding.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's interesting how grassroots all of this really was. And we've seen that come to life when all of the witnesses took the stand. It everybody sprouted up from all over the place, and it was a beautiful thing. But I'll shift gears here a little bit and move into the commission itself. So I'm kind of hoping with your help, we can paint a clear picture of the whole process. As far as I know, to my knowledge, the Emergencies Act was only ever invoked one other time during the FLQ crisis, when it was named the Emergency War Measures Act. And the way it lies currently, can you just give us a run through, from a legal point of view, what needs to happen for it to be met?
So I'm just going to correct you a little bit there. So it's it's never been used in this form. So, okay. And I want to pull up the Emergencies Act so I have the right definition for you. But with the FLQ crisis, it was still under the old legislation, which was the War Measures Act. And after that, that's when the Parliament was like, I think we need to revamp it. And so this is the first time. That's the earlier version of it. But with this new Emergencies Act, this is the first time it was ever invoked.
Thank you for clarifying that.
And your question about the definition and how it when it gets triggered, I guess, is very good, because that ended up being one of the main points at the end. So interestingly, when we were there, the first 5 weeks, as counsel for the protesters, we're like, wow, this is, we're doing really great. It's so clear that there's no way that there's any justification to invoke the Emergencies Act. It just looked like a mismanagement on the part of different government officials and police authorities. And mismanagement, I also include incompetence in some regards, because you see that they just weren't up to task. And what they were using a term, their justification was resources. We didn't have enough resources. But I don't think in Canada we could keep going back to that. I think that it looks like we're incredibly overregulated. There's lots of different departments and divisions. There was incredible intelligence from the OPP. They had the resources for the intelligence. It was just a matter of mismanagement and miscommunication about how to use that intelligence, and even not even knowing about that intelligence. So yeah, that was a bit hard to watch, as it was constantly resources. Then we got to the last week, and it all of a sudden turned on. There's a broader definition of what it means to trigger the national okay, now I want to get the words right, the definition of security, national security, for the Emergencies Act. Because in the Emergencies Act, if you look at it, and that's what I was just trying to pull up, but I'm just going to go off memory, is it basically says you have to look at the definition under the CSIS Act. And under the CSIS Act, national security threat is very well defined. And Brendan Miller spoke about the definition in his opening statement, and I went back to that in the closing statement. And it's espionage, it's overthrowing the government by violence. So there's very specific definition. And what the federal government was doing in the last week is they were saying that one is so narrow, it's not broad enough for the Emergencies Act. And so when we were looking at the Emergencies Act, we looked at this wider new definition of national security threat that we believe was justified to invoke the Emergencies Act.
Yeah, we heard this overthrowing the government theme a couple times through the inquiry, and it was silly, you know, to say the least about it. I mean, like they tried to cling to the fact that James Botter from Canada Unity, who had prepared what he thought was a document that would help, you know, do whatever it did, and clearly it didn't. But they really clinged on to that, and I like how Tom Marazzo mentions, he's like, nobody was trying to overthrow the government by writing out a piece of paper and people signing off on it and putting it in a mailbox and trying to mail it to you.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I said overthrowing the government by violence. And
Right.
so, yeah, James, and that happened in 2021. He sent it by registered mail to the Governor General with, I think, 150,000 signatures. So just that in itself, you understand that a lot of people tagged on. Like, honestly, I think my mom even signed it. Like, there's a lot of people that just didn't know the process, that weren't, you know, they saw something online that they could sign and they went for it. But to even suggest that that's an overthrowing of the government that would trigger the national security definition, it's just so ridiculous on a whole. And another thing I just wanted to mention, and we could talk about this a bit more, is the week that the protesters were testifying, and including, there was a bit more with like some of the Windsor protesters and Coots, which I don't know much about myself, or I didn't until they testified. But you see how so far from extremists or terrorists these people are. Like, you know, maybe not the most sophisticated in terms of knowing about the law, and they shouldn't, because not everyone should have a law degree to understand the law. And if that's the problem, that we don't understand civics enough, that's something we have to do with educating the public, instead of then punishing the public for misunderstanding the best way to go about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember personally when I seen that document floating around on the internet, it gave some people hope, and it just gave them hope because, you know, people were trying the legal process. People were trying to get a hold of regional counselors. People were trying to get a hold of provincial, members of parliament, and nobody was being heard. You would reach out to the media and you would try and address it with the media, and they didn't want to hear your side of the story. So really, Canadians were just desperate at that point, and they were very hopeful, and I think that's all that happened with that document.
Yeah, and to add to what you were saying, because that's a very good point. People, the court process is so slow, and we've seen, like in a case I was involved with, the vaccine mandate. That was, the federal court threw that away recently and saying that that's moot. So there you have some Canadians going through the legal route, which is expensive and long, let me remind you, and that's not working out either. They don't even have their day in court. But the second thing I wanted to say is, you were saying that people were reaching out to their government and their elected officials and they weren't being heard. But not only that, and that's why, I think so many people have been very complimentary of the cross-examination I conducted and the closing remarks, because they were getting vilified. Canadians not only weren't being heard, but they were being told that you're not acceptable, that you're a racist, that you're a misogynist, that you're all of these things, when it's the furthest thing from the truth. And it just became such a division, such a dirty, ugly division created by our leaders. And how are you not supposed to stand up for yourself?
Yeah, it's always important to keep mentioning that. And it's interesting you say that, because, I talk to my girlfriend and my family about it often. I say, one of the coolest things about the convoy is it was actually so diverse. It was such a unique experience that I seen myself taking part in indigenous healing ceremonies, people of the Sikh community. I was going and getting educated about them and what they're about, getting to try all these different like cultural dishes. Like it was the coolest experience, and I'm so glad that I got to be a part of it. You got to be a part of it, and so many different Canadians got to. It's definitely something that we're never going to forget. Another. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to add to that's exactly what we heard from so many people. And you mentioned indigenous healing circles, and it's too bad, because we did want to bring in more witnesses to the commission, but as you saw, it was already quite intensive. I'm not sure if I agree completely with the scheduling, and I'll mention one thing about it later if you remind me. But there was a couple Indigenous clan mothers that were in attendance at the Freedom Convoy most of the time, and they prepared statements and they wanted to be witnesses. And one thing they did share in their witness statement is when they were there in February, that was the first time they really saw a true reconciliation. Like you're saying, all these people from different backgrounds, for once, really coming together as one, as Canadians. Like there was really this one common voice, one common mission that everybody wanted, and they were so in it together. And that's, I think, shows you how when everyone has a common goal, they're not going to be sidetracked by the violence and anything else, because they were so set on the goal of being heard and being there for the right reasons.
That's right. I could only imagine how hard this has been for someone like Tamara. We've seen politicians, the media, and people with just oppositional views completely smear her for her opinion, views, values. I just want to know what it was like for you to be there and experience her. She's been completely silenced with her bail conditions. To see her finally get to sit down on national TV and get to explain her side of the story. How was it to like being a part of that? What was that like for you?
Well, yeah, I can't believe those conditions yet, and how incredibly silent she is. In a way, it's kind of a blessing in disguise for her that she doesn't have to see the comments, because she can't even log into any social media, let alone defend herself. So she doesn't have to see the vulgar things people are saying, because they saw what MSM was portraying her as, and going with this government speak that came out early on about terrorism. Like this woman is a grandmother, like a kind-hearted person that, like everybody else in Ottawa, was tired with what the government was doing and was trying to affect something. And it wasn't, and all she asked for was everyone to listen to the police and do it in peace and togetherness, not at all ever calling for violence. So for her to go through all of that, I've been with her quite a bit, and I know she's a very strong person. And I was very glad that she was able to, on a national world scale, give her evidence. She also, as you probably saw from clips, attended almost all the time. So if you're somebody that doesn't believe in the system and is looking to overthrow the system, and you're really an extremist or a terrorist, would you be participating in this kind of process every day the way she is? Of course not. And I think that did turn some people's opinions as well. Her being there, her testimony that she gave, her answers, I think she was finally able to tell her story. And I'm really glad she was able to do that. I think she held herself very well through it all.
I think she did a fantastic job, and I can't wait till the day I'm able to sit down and interview her. I look forward to that. I know the public's opinion changed after hearing what she's gone through in her side of the story, because I've talked to people personally in my life who don't agree with me and don't agree with my opinions and the way I feel, and that's okay. That's what freedom's all about. And I know after they heard Tamara in the cross-examination, I actually had a really close family member that we haven't gotten along so well, and they let me know instantly that this person was clearly not the person that they made her out to be.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that, I have to say, that went with, for me, all the protesters. Like, I didn't know much about Pat King. Like, I knew what they were saying in the media, and same with Jeremy McKenzie. I always keep saying Jeremy Maguire. That's how much I know about him. But they all, and James Bowder, who we talked about momentarily too. Like, these are not extremists. These are not terrorists. These are just, like I said, maybe they don't understand the law so much, but they shouldn't have to. They should be able to express their dissatisfaction with the government and not be vilified for it the way they were. I know Chris Barber and Tamara very well, and you see Chris Barber too, like such an honest, like he's from a small town, trucking, farming family, and that's exactly who he is. What you saw on the stand is that person. And his whole life is on his TikTok. There's not much to hide. He does like 5 TikToks a day or something. It's exactly who he is. All those people were so honest, so genuine, and so clearly not the people they were made out to be.
Yeah, it's very clear that we've kind of gotten to a point in Canada where people with different political opinions are being treated like this. The other thing I wanted to bring up is I felt a little sense of healing when I watched this commission when it comes to what happened at the end in Ottawa there, when we were all there, and what happened with the police and the violence we witnessed and seen. There was a certain level of integrity that came out. I noticed when I believe it was Superintendent Pat Morris of the OPP, when he gave his testimony, you could tell that he was very fair. He wasn't necessarily, I wouldn't say he was siding with the protesters, but he seemed to be siding with the current laws that are in place. Would you agree with me?
Yeah. Oh, I loved Pat Morris because he was talking about the facts. And that's one thing that I say about the commission a lot, and what I heard from testimony is it was a lot of fiction over facts, or feelings over facts. Even Trudeau and Freeland, they were saying that there was the potential for violence. That's not reality. That isn't violence. That's the potential. That's fiction, in other words, because it wasn't actually the case. And Pat Morris was 100% all about facts. He was so credible. He was so professional. And this was the intelligence officer for the Ontario Police, Provincial Police. And we didn't see that with Commissioner Lucky, who was, the commissioner for the whole RCMP. We didn't see that kind of credibility, that kind of factual evidence from somebody in her position, which is exactly what you would expect. When you compare the two, you really see why we ended up in this situation, because it wasn't about facts on a federal level. It was all about the feelings or the fiction.
Yeah, exactly. Even another point that I felt was kind of strong is when it came up to CSIS after the police were done, and the director Alan Vigneault came up. Correct me
David
if I'm
Vigneault.
wrong. David Vigneault, thank you. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, because I'm trying to keep track of everything. But I believe after everything was spelt out from Section 2 of the CSIS Act, he agreed that the threshold wasn't met, but he also agreed that it should have been invoked. Can you kind of explain what he was? I don't really get it.
No, and I love that you said it that way, because if we're talking about a national security threat, should anybody ever say, I don't really get it? Of course not. It should be so black and white, and we should not be having this conversation as Canadians as what was going on. Did they think the definition was met or wasn't it? That's where we have a problem here. And I totally agree with you. And how I understand it, and I could be wrong too, because that just came out of, that was a curveball we got Sunday right before the CSIS panel went up. So everything up until that point showed that a CSIS confirmed that the definition was of national security threat was not met. Everything that we saw. Then Sunday, the day before CSIS panel was up, Sunday, like later afternoon, the commission sent out this second interview summary that they did quite a few weeks before, saying that Vigneault and that panel said, if the definition for the Emergencies Act, the definition for the Emergencies Act is a bit broader, and then that national security threat would be justified. That just came out of nowhere on Sunday. And that's what he testified to on Monday. So kind of going now with, then we saw that more throughout the week with the federal government and federal ministers saying that the Emergencies Act definition was different and broader than the one in the CSIS Act, which is this doesn't even make sense to me. And today I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, because today there was a panel that discussed the national security definition, because the commission isn't completely over. All of the evidence is done, but right now academics, and actually the CSIS former director was speaking today with the commissioner and talking about this exact thing. And he was saying that if we're not going to take intelligence seriously, and that's kind of what he was talking about, that's not a good thing. And if we're just playing with the definition of national security threat, it becomes meaningless. And I very much agree with that. And it's exactly going to your point of not understanding it. If Canadians, we don't understand it, or if the authorities and intelligence officers can't clearly spell it out for us, that is not a good thing in Canada.
Right. Now, I also wanted to ask you, am I correct in saying that from what I understood, when Vigneault gave his testimony to the commission, or not his testimony, the written interview or whatever, did he at first not say that this was a national security threat? And then later on, like right before the commission, a few weeks or whatever, when he had the next interview, that changed all of a sudden?
Yes. So the first summary said that I did not see, there was the definition of national security threat under the CSIS Act was not met. So like I was saying, everything up until that point had that evidence. On Sunday, there was a second witness summary that came about from an in-camera, so a secret closed meeting with the commission, and there they put to him asking, but if the definition under the Emergencies Act was broader, would it qualify, and did you say that to the prime minister? And that's where he said yes. So it's very odd. Why would it? This is quite important if we're talking about the justification for the Emergencies Act. And he said, well, nobody asked me that before. I think that's something you volunteer, is I told the prime minister that this fit the definition. You don't forget that in your, especially if you're somebody like the director of CSIS. I could guarantee you Pat Morris wouldn't forget exactly what he said, because he was credible, he was professional, and I would take what he says at his word. But when people's evidence changes like that, it's a little bit less credible to me.
I was just going to ask you to touch up on that. Now, when it comes to credibility, when people start dancing all over the place and they're not looking that good in the eyes of let's say Justice Rouleau, is that how that works then? How does that work?
Exactly that way. So what a judge's role is you get all this evidence, and when there's two different stories, what do? You have to assess it based on credibility. So if you and I say exactly two different things, then the judge is going to be like, oh, Rob is being, everything he said was a lot more credible. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because he was more credible, and his evidence is going to have more weight than that Eva who was dancing around like you said about it. So that's how it's supposed to happen. So we're going to see when the report comes out where Justice Rouleau takes his evidence from and where he gives more weight to which evidence.
Yeah, I mean, this could be a pretty scary thing if he were to not rule in favor of the law. I would dare to say, because it seems to be pretty clear that there's an understanding of how this should be invoked, and it really seems like that was not met. And even towards the end, when everybody started speaking, like at the end when everyone had time to give their presentation, I was under the impression that a lot of the council speaking on behalf of the police seemed to not really go with that flow either.
Yeah, well, none of the police authorities said that. There was, it just, like I said, turned on that last week. And I guess I should have expected it because it was the ministers. And I guess I shouldn't have expected them to come to the commission and say, oh, shucks, darn, we made a mistake. They were defending it, as much as they could. So they said that there was a legal opinion about it. But I would encourage your viewers to go and look at this morning's roundtable on the definition of national security threat, because there was one of the panelists that said too, that she said that I do not believe it's the role of this commission to be looking at changing the definition of national security threat. She said that's not what this is about. So I'm with her. There was a lot of good stuff coming out today. Yesterday or the day before, it was a little bit more like they hadn't heard the evidence, and it was all of this still MSM talking points. But otherwise, there's, to invoke the Emergencies Act should be an incredibly high threshold, and we should not have any doubts about it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm just going to click on a couple questions here some viewers have asked. So were you frustrated in cross-examining Mr. JT? I asked these questions because when I was listening to Mr. JT's response, I felt as if I wanted to turf my lunch.
Well, so I have to say that was my first time cross-examining on that stage. And I have to commend all the lawyers that cross-examined, because that's not a normal cross-examination. When you have 10 minutes or 5 minutes to cross-examine, it is not normal. Usually, you have half a day to cross-examine somebody, or a full day. So you're on there and you ask a question, and then if they start with their talking points, you have to kind of sum it up. We did make a strategic decision to have me ask the questions, because we weren't expecting Justin Trudeau to again, side with us and say you're right, everything you guys have been saying has been right, and I made an error in invoking the Emergencies Act. That would have been beautiful, at least to acknowledge it. But it was about asking the questions and putting it to him that he's really hurt people as a leader of the country. Like the question was, shouldn't you be uniting people instead of dividing them? And about, not keeping my lunch in. I hadn't had an opportunity to eat much of a lunch, so that helped. But I really just wanted to do, I wanted to speak for millions of Canadians, which I had the opportunity to do. And, it I heard the answers, but it was more about getting the questions out that I know millions of Canadians wanted to hear put to him.
Yeah, so we'll take one more. Marissa says, Rob, please ask her about the question about calling names. There are many videos to prove that he lied. So I think what people have been asking is, in your opinion, I guess, did Justin Trudeau perjure himself?
Yeah, so of course that's come up a lot, and one MP nicely has actually said that. So how it works with perjury too is it's a criminal code violation. So it wouldn't be something that we just go to court about, but a police officer in Ontario would have to go and charge him. The likelihood of that happening is not very high, I think. And the second point of it is he kind of qualified his response, I think, by saying, I was highlighting this about the unvaccinated and not trusting the science. I agree. It's not right and it's not fair. I don't know if that's going to change anything. I do think that we have to keep the pressure on this prime minister. And I think that's how we take it. But it would be for a police officer to take the next step.
Yeah, I actually heard Viva Fry do a take on this last night as well. And
Okay.
he said this pretty much the exact same thing you just said. He said, do I want him to go down for perjury? Yes. He goes, there's a pretty strict guideline of that, though. And he goes, do I think it'll happen? No, it's not going to happen.
The thing is, this isn't what our leaders should be doing. That's the point. That's why we should keep applying the pressure. And if the political pressure and the population, pressures him enough about saying this is not how you lead people, by lying, by calling them names, by dividing Canadians instead of uniting him. That's how we apply the pressure. But unfortunately, I don't think it will be by a police officer.
No, well, you did a wonderful job, though, because, I got to say, it was really interesting. I was on this stream, and I think there was probably about maybe 500, 600 people watching at the time. And, we're at the end of the game, and all of Canada's waiting, and they think Brendan Miller's coming to the plate, and boom, we got a pitch hitter. Here comes Eva. So I got to ask, was that part of the game plan? Like, was this a game time decision on the day, or was this something that the team knew was going to happen?
Well, we had made the decision before that day. And it was, like I said, the approach was different. Like, Brendan Miller is a brilliant litigator and cross-examiner. And again, I'm commending everyone that did it. And he put in his time. He was a heavy hitter on all of this. And then when we were talking about, okay, now we have to talk about the voices of the Canadians, and putting that to Justin Trudeau, he was like, you could see him trying to work through how he was going to do that from his perspective. So it just made sense for us. He also worked so hard, like what he did with Katie Telford and the PMO office the day before, and Freeland. Like, it was beautiful. And he basically sealed the deal on the legal case, in our opinion, the day before. So the next day was really to be about putting to Justin Trudeau what he did to Canadians. And I think it's kind of well known that the prime minister isn't the best sometimes when strong women approach him. And if you notice, actually, too, a few of the teams had the woman lawyer representing the group. It happened with Slowly. Even Paul Champ didn't cross-examine the OPS officer or services they used. And I don't know if that was strategic on their part as well, but it was interesting to watch that. And, you know, I've been involved since February, and a lot of people didn't even know that I was involved at all. Keith had the spotlight in February, and then Brendan took the spotlight the whole time. So when I had the opportunity to finally put my face forward on behalf of, you know, so many people that I hold so dear to my heart, and I've been so involved with, I was so pleased to be able to do it.
Yeah, you know, when I was watching, you know, and like I said, everyone was just shocked, and it was funny because, to be honest with you, everybody on the stream is like commenting, and they're like, "No, no, no, what happened?" Just because everyone was all hyped about Miller, right? And then by the time you were done, and I want to say you were like 8 or 10 minutes, or you could have been longer, I'm not sure, but by the time you were done, everybody was just like totally changed. They're all like, "Wow, that was so good. She did awesome. It was perfect." And
You're making
in
me
my
blush.
well, in my opinion, it painted a clear picture to me. I felt like, wow, everything that's happened in the past couple of years, this is where we're at, Canada. This is what it takes for you to be heard, to sit down with this man and finally have some questions asked. You need to have the Emergency Measures Act invoked and have one of our lawyers tell us how Canadians feel.
Yeah.
Was that kind of what your intentions were with that?
100%. It was about Canada. It was about what, and I said it in the question, I read those statements. We read it so he heard why people came to Canada, so he felt it. And that was why we made the change. It just made sense from all perspectives. Again, I was super keen to do it because nobody knew who I was, and I'd been around all these people since I experienced it too. So, you know, I was there the whole time, but I'm really glad that people appreciated it. I was humbled and honored to do it.
Great. Thanks. Thank you so much. You know, you did a good job, and thanks for jumping on here with us tonight. I really appreciate it. Can you give us a little bit of insight as to what's going on this week? I know if I'm understanding right, it's about policies and what have you.
Yeah. So it's a full week of kind of academics talking, which can sound boring. I totally get it. But it's actually like today, this morning was the definition of national security threat. And there was a former CSIS director talking, and a woman, a professor that studies the CSIS Act and the Emergencies Act quite a bit, and terrorism and all that stuff. And it was such a good discussion because you could really hear the different views and how they were talking about how intelligence just isn't being used. Like we heard in the Jody Thomas and Freelance saying, we need more intelligence and we need our own intelligence. And he's like, that is not a good thing for politicians just to have their own intelligence when there's already so much intelligence. Use the intelligence we have. And if they don't understand it, that's a problem. So like I'm saying, that was an incredibly good discussion. There was a discussion on Monday about the charter rights and freedoms and your right to protest. In the afternoon, it was about crowdsourcing and FinTrack. This afternoon, it was about police response to the Emergencies Act. So they're quite really intensive talks and all pertinent. Like I didn't know what to expect from the roundtables, but they're very informative. And what the purpose of it is for 6 weeks we heard all the evidence, and right now you're having these academics or former directors of CSIS or whatever talking about their views. So then what Commissioner Rouleau is going to do is he's going to take all of this in, and in February 20th he has a deadline to put a report back to the government and say, this is everything I heard. I think that the problems were here, here, and here. And from what I heard in the policy week, you should make changes here, here, and here. And I think we need to keep an eye on it, make sure that we're still being vigilant as Canadians, because like I said, there was some of the presenters that were talking on Monday that it didn't sound like they heard any of the evidence from the commission about how really crime rate went down. It was more still feelings over facts, the threat of violence over actual violence. So we have to keep an eye on these things still.
Yeah, like that was so frustrating for me to hear about this non-existent threat of violence. And and I know, if you go to a hockey game and there's 18,000 people in an arena, if you go to the Canada Day celebration in Ottawa and there's 10,000 people there, well, that many people in the same place at the same time, there is always a potential that something can happen, but that's not a threat.
And actually, great point too, Rob, because if you look at just Google Stanley Cup riot and see how many arrests there were, like I think in Vancouver, the riot had 200 plus arrests in one night. And the evidence that we have, I think it was like 14 arrests over 3 weeks until the Emergencies Act was invoked, and then it was more. And this is something, again, like I said, Pat Morris with the most credible information. He actually said the lack of serious violence was shocking. The lack of it. Because like you said, the amount of people that you would see, and like in a hockey game or a Stanley Cup ride or a Canadian Day gone wild, you would see way more arrests. But going back to where I started is when people had a mission and they knew what their goal was there. It was to be peaceful. It was just to be heard by the government. It wasn't to cause violence. It wasn't to cause a disturbance, although that did happen as a side result, just because there were so many people. And they were poorly escorted by the police. Like, this was such a mismanaged event. It could have been managed so much better. And nobody asked to be parked on the street. That's where they were directed. And so that was a failure on the city of Ottawa and the Ottawa police not to have managed that better. And yeah, it
seemed like initially too, when this all started, when you were hearing everybody's different pieces of evidence, it was like this circle that was going around where everybody was trying to pass the blame off on each other. And it made me realize at that time, I already knew this, but it made me realize, like, okay, everybody has done a little something wrong, except for all of these people here who protested.
Yeah. Well, and so, I'm with you, but there were, I guess, a few troublemakers, and there always will be. And that's what the law is for. And that's why some of people were taken, whatever, they were arrested, if that's the case. But we don't even know who those people were. Like, that's the other thing. We asked for that information. We asked to tell us exactly how many protesters were charged and for what. We never got that information except for that chart that was made available, and Brendan cross-examined on it, and it showed 12 or 14 or something like that protesters. So yeah, and it's funny you say that too, because there was one day when we had been like 2 weeks into the inquiry, and there was a new face in like the coffee place, and I said, "Oh, who are you with?" And he said, "The Ottawa Police Services." And then he asked who I was with, and I said, "The protesters." And I said, "The innocent victims in this." And that's how I felt. Like, everyone's pointing the finger. Everyone, yes, ought to take some blame for it. And then there's these protesters that just to Ottawa to, say that we're not really happy with you right now. And then they're shamed. They're called names, and then they're beaten in the end.
Yeah, I know. And another really important part not important part, but the dogs are almost done. Sorry about that, guys. Another really touching part, though, that I wanted to say is when we got to hear testimony from Chris Deering. That was incredible. Like, what was that like to be there for that?
Oh, my heart. I think he said like 3 times, it was my duty to be there. And some people didn't catch on to, like, he was the sole survivor in a bomb explosion in Afghanistan, and that caused him brain injury. And you could see that sometimes when he was asked a question and he couldn't remember what the question was and asked to be repeated. And that was, you could see just the heart this man has and how he felt he had to come to Ottawa to help protect the Canadians. And that's actually another thing I heard is a lot of Canadians maybe didn't agree with the convoy, but when the Emergencies Act was invoked and they saw what the state funded violence on these Canadian citizens, they thought that was wrong and they came to Ottawa at that point, just like he did, because that's not the way this is supposed to go. And you heard they didn't even ask people to leave. They throw some like pieces of paper up. And we saw it too. And we're like, and we had a direct line. Police officers had our cell phones. Why didn't they talk to us? They were talking to us sometimes like 5 times a day, calling us. They couldn't just say, okay, you're today, whatever. Or like Justice Rouleau at the beginning, Commissioner Rouleau was saying, was there another place that they were given to peacefully protest? And they weren't. Like, but yeah, Chris Deering's testimony was just heartbreaking.
It was. That was my big thing too, is like when this went down that day, I noticed right away, it was like, okay, the big issue was all these vehicles parked on the street and everything, but they were gone. And then once they were gone, it continued to happen. And then that's when I was like, okay, this is getting really bad, because everything you wanted, like all these vehicles gone, they're gone. And the police are just still stacked everywhere and accelerating, what's going on. But, there's a lot of Canadians that have trauma still from that day and always will. And I don't like to admit it, but I'm probably one of them as well. It was a really hard thing to experience after all of that time being with the people in Ottawa and just being united and finally coming together after we were so divided. So I just really want to thank you for taking this on. And I know that, as a lawyer, a lot of lawyers have shied away from this stuff, and it's very disheartening. So thank you. Thank you for standing on the right side of history, and thank you for being a voice on behalf of Canadians. I really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. And it's really been a team effort. And, I was so like honored to be there in February and working with the Canadians, like Tamara and Chris right from the start. Like I got to see who these people really were. And it was just, I'm with you. I can't believe more lawyers didn't take a stand when the laws were the government was overreaching so much. Like it didn't take a lot just to be like, that's going too far now. And just looking at other countries, what they're doing, like you don't even have to understand the science, but you understand what other countries are doing. So it's unfortunate. It's very messy when you work for a big group. The other thing is, if you're putting your face on a public stage, you're going to get vilified too. Just like Tamara and Chris and others, but Keith endured that quite a bit. Now that my face is out there, that's I'm getting haters, and of course Brendan Miller for everything he did there too. And it's just not fair. Like we should be, as lawyers, we have to advocate for our clients, and that is our job. And then to get these kind of like just messages of hate for representing your clients, I don't understand how Canada has gotten so divided and so vile. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, well, I think, in my opinion, the biggest thing that this commission could have done is being done is it's just everyone was tuned into it. The media was covering it, maybe not in our best interest, but that's why there's people who have taken on things like we're doing right now. And in the independent media is skyrocketing right now as we're watching the collapse of state-funded media. And that doesn't just happen by design. It's clearly with a mistrust from the general demographic of Canadians who used to consume it, but now we're starting to see things for what they were. I know I'm taking a step backwards here, but one thing I wanted to bring up that was really nice to see come out on the record is someone like myself who really thinks a lot. When I heard this commission was going on, I was like, oh, it's just going to be a big setup and whatnot. Because sometimes us critical thinkers, we think too much. But it was really nice to see Brendan Miller address things publicly and your team, the way you guys did. Like, I know they wanted everyone to send an email quietly under the thing. And it was like, well, you didn't address the email the way you were supposed to. So now we're going to bring it up in front of the public on national TV. And I think that's what Canadians really needed to see to have a little bit of faith in the process that's going on right now.
Yeah, and I have to say that was so frustrating for all of us on the team, and other groups felt it too. When you're in this intensive process, 6 weeks, and you saw the hours where they're all day, every day, and then you have to prepare for the next day. How on earth are you supposed to also prepare a written motion? Like, I think when the day that, there was the kerfuffle and he got kicked out, he was trying to make an oral motion, which in my opinion makes total sense in this kind of a intensive process, especially when all the lawyers are there. That's what we do as lawyers. We argue on our feet, and that's what we're supposed to do. There's no point to draft an email. And like you said, Canadians don't see it. And when we do it publicly, or even if it wasn't done publicly, which was fine, and I've talked about this, comparing it to the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial. I know that sounds silly, but all of the evidence was televised. But then I think it was like on a Friday or Saturday, I can't recall. They didn't have the cameras on, and they were addressing procedural issues and things like that. And that certainly would have helped our process, because we could have talked about that, whether or not that was on camera or not. It would have been better for lawyers to be able to ask the questions, get the answers, instead of then asking us to draft a written submission, send it into the commission, not have an answer on the last week of the hearing. Like, when are we supposed to address this? So there were things coming out even to the last day, right before Trudeau was testifying. Some evidence came in less redacted than it was before.
I was just going to ask you that. I was going to say how I don't recall exactly what it was, but I remember Jody Thomas, Miller saying something about Jody Thomas. If we knew this during cross-examination, we would have brought it up and it would have been a different story. Is there any hopes that one day, at some point, at some time, that there might be a way some of this stuff will be unredacted and available to the public, or is it looking like it's too late for that?
That's a good question. So the next step would be that you would take this, it would be called a judicial review. So you would review Rouleau's decision about redacting, because we put in a motion that asked for even more redactions to come out. And you probably saw Rouleau, that after Brendan was kicked out, the decision did come out, and he agreed with the government on 2 of the 3 redactions and not on the 3rd one. So I think our points are still very strong. And again, he did that so beautifully with Katie Telford, when he showed the redacted version of her assistant's notes, not even her notes. And so he said, was there a lawyer present there? No, I don't think so. So why on earth is there a redaction on solicitor-client privilege? That's your lawyer giving you advice. And that's the reason. If there's no lawyer present, there should be no redaction for it. The second one that was there was parliamentary privilege. She's not part of the cabinet. Why would she be claiming parliamentary privilege? And we had tons of documents like it. So what happens with that decision, you would have to take it to federal court and ask a federal court judge to review Commissioner Rouleau's decision. That would be the next step to get it more redacted.
Somebody just asked a good question here. I'll put it up just quick. I think I know the answer to this, but does the judge see the documents himself unredacted?
No, and he did see some of them. So the ones that we put, I think there were like 6 documents that we asked to be reviewed, and he did. So in that decision you see of his, he said, I've seen the unredacted versions. I'm asking the government to produce unredacted versions of the parliamentary privilege and send it off. So The other thing is, there is absolutely no way Commissioner Rouleau saw all of the evidence that was there. You like what you saw, the public was probably like 1/100th of what was filed. There were so many documents, and the government of Canada just kept dumping more documents on us until the very end. And that was another frustration on our end. The other thing, maybe this gives me an idea of what we could put in our submissions too, is that we say that one of the requests we have is that Commissioner Rouleau asks that more of this is unredacted where it doesn't make sense. And if this ever were to happen again, the government of Canada cannot put these documents in last minute. That it's not fair, and it's not reasonable for the transparency of a process like this.
Yeah, that's probably not something that you typically see in practice. Things just getting put through that at the end like that.
Well, and this is why legal processes usually are so slow, because like lawyers love documents and they want all the papers about everything to do with anything. Even you think it has nothing to do with anything, we want it all. That's how lawyers work. But when the process is this time constrained, and the government of Canada ought to have known, they were the first ones that should have been producing all of the relevant documents, not the last ones. They're the ones that invoke the Emergencies Act. It's their responsibility to put that information to the commission so we can all assess it and the commission can make a decision. It shouldn't be on us to beg and ask for that information. So normally in a court process, you would never see it last minute because you're given huge amounts of time to obtain it and a huge amount of time to review it. In this case, none of that happened.
Okay, Eva, is there anything else that I didn't cover that you want to put out there?
No, I think I'm so glad that so many people have been so involved, and people like you guys have been live streaming it, because I think that's so important right now. I really hope that this process at least opened the eyes for Canadians that we have to keep an eye on what's going on in our government. I think we are going to be winning, like somebody just wrote, because we have to keep our government officials to account. Canadians have been apathetic. We're super nice people, and we kind of let things go a little bit too long. And I think we have to say, enough is enough. This is our government. This is our tax money. We pay so much in taxes. Let's see what we're getting out of that.
Yeah, a lot of people talk about these parallel communities and all these things, and I say, yes, they're important too, but we really need to pay attention to what's going on right now, because the reason we're in the position we're in right now is because for far too long we didn't pay attention and we didn't care.
Yeah.
So, okay, Ava, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to let you go now, and I'm hoping that we can talk to you again another time.
Anytime. It was my pleasure. Thanks, Rob.
Okay, have a good one. Okay, guys. Well, there you have it. That was really nice to have Eva on here with us. What a sweet lady. She did a fantastic job representing all Canadians there for us in Ottawa. And yeah, I'm going to let you guys go, and we'll see you next time.